From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. An hour's drive from the capital of El Salvador stands a sprawling complex spread out over almost 60 acres and hemmed in by towering white walls and barbed wire. It's an oasis of concrete and steel, surrounded by wilderness as far as the eye can see.
Well, it is sort of the Alcatraz of the 21st century, but it looks from the outside like an industrial centre, really, but it's what goes on inside which is very deliberately alarming. It's not like a traditional prison with small cells with individuals or just a few people in each one. This is a brand new prison designed with cells each for 100 men. Noticeably, when you get close to it, all cell phone coverage stops. That's very deliberate to try and prevent a pervasive problem of Latin American prisons, that they often become centres for crime and crimes are run from the prison. So there's absolutely none of that. When people arrive there, they're stripped. They're given white shorts, white t-shirt, white trainers, and they're told that this is it. You're probably never going to leave this place. You're going to die in this prison, and there's no escape, and there will be no mercy, really, for the people that end up there.
This mega prison, the largest in Latin America and a pet project of El Salvador's president Nayib Bukele, is known as the Terrorism Confinement Center, or SECOT. It's home to thousands of prisoners who've fallen foul of Bukele's crushing crackdown on gang crime. And as of 2 months ago, it's also home to over 200 Venezuelan men who've fallen foul of President Trump's crackdown on immigration. How did that happen? And what does the budding relationship between these two powerful leaders tell us about the future of both countries? The story today: Trump's bromance with the world's coolest dictator.
I'm Stephen Gibbs, and I cover Latin America for The Times and the Sunday Times.
Stephen, you've recently returned from a trip to El Salvador. Just explain why you went there.
Well, El Salvador, a Central American nation of 6.5 million people, historically hasn't really ever had quite as much world attention as it's been having in the last few weeks and months. And the main reason is it is the destination of hundreds of deportees that have been removed from the United States by the Trump administration. And most of them are ending up in this brutal prison called SECOT in El Salvador. And that's put a focus not just on what Trump is doing, but also on what the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, has done in that country to try and confront crime.
Well, Stephen, we'll talk about that prison in a moment. Before we do, give us a sense of how much the country has changed recently. I assume you've been before. What was it like on this trip?
Absolutely extraordinary change. It's like a sort of revolution, really, what's happened there on the core problem that El Salvador has faced for decades, and that is gang crime. This is a country there was a sort of shadow government, really, of two gangs that operated there, and they made people's lives a misery. I went there last 15 years ago, and, you definitely wouldn't go out at night. Now, San Salvador, the capital, is sort of buzzing at 1 o'clock in the morning. This is a traumatized nation that's suddenly woken up to the fact that it's a safe place. And, that story was repeated to me over and over again from all sorts of different people, from business people, from rich people to poor people.
The security situation changed about 5 years ago when the government put in place the regime.
One was Wasi Giovanni, who was I was put in touch with. He was a surf instructor now.
Before, it was really complicated to go to different places in El Salvador, because if you were from a place that belonged to one gang and there was another place that belonged to another gang, you couldn't go to that place.
He used to live on the coast in a little village called Libertad, and he described to me the horrors of his life until 5 years ago.
I don't know. I was always in places where there was killing, and you heard a lot of gunshots and people dying from gunshots, blood being spilt, all of that.
He was genuinely horrified about the situation he was in. Most of his family had emigrated. He didn't think he'd live beyond the age of 40. And then suddenly there's this extraordinary change that's happened because of this security policy there. And he, like everyone else, is in this kind of mix of delight and shock.
Yes, everything's normal now. You can leave your car unlocked or something, and that's normal. You can be on the streets and no one is going to rob you. It feels really good to walk down the streets and, go to places you've never visited before.
For me as well, as you say, I'd been there before, and you just felt like you were going to a completely different country, really.
And just to understand the scale of this transformation, I mean, give us the numbers. How much has changed?
El Salvador's gone from one of the most dangerous places in the world to one of the safest. So in 2015, there were over 6,000 murders a year. So it was approximately one every hour in a place the size of Wales. Now, last year, the way we got the latest figures in 2024, there were just 114 murders during the entire year. So that's a 98% decrease in a decade. And the US, which wants to be on the side of El Salvador at the moment, but the State Department, which is, we believe independent in these figures, it's changed its travel advice for El Salvador. So it says US visitors who are going to El Salvador, it's ranked as the sort of one of the safest places to visit. In fact, safer, according to the State Department, than both the United Kingdom and France. So a big change going from a place where you'd have to be very cautious to, a place on par with going to the more tranquil parts of Switzerland.
I mean, Stephen, those figures really are astonishing. A 98% decrease is remarkable in any country. So just talk us through how they've managed to make this happen. You said it was almost a revolution. How has it happened?
Well, it's happened under the watch of this president, Nayib Bukele.
En estos momentos, podemos anunciar con plena certeza que hemos ganado la presidencia de la República.
He became president of El Salvador in 2019. He'd previously been a mayor of San Salvador, but he was, one of this new sort of generation of political leaders who say, I'm not a politician, really, I'm something else.
Es decir, no es el peso de un departamento el que nos hizo ganar, sino que unánimemente hemos ganado en todo El Salvador.
One of his things he said he'd do is sort out the security, which is, clearly the biggest problem, or was the biggest problem there. He imposed a state of emergency, and it meant that the police and the army could go really without any restrictions at all and arrest whoever they felt was allied to a gang and imprison them without trial.
For 10 days, the country's national police has been operating with less restrictions. They say they've arrested over 6,000 suspected gang members, tracking them in neighborhoods, inside homes, and even hiding underground.
This was done at a quite extraordinary pace. They were taking about 1,000 men off the streets every day, imprisoning them. And then by 2023, of course, they began to run out of space to put these people. So that's when he constructed this SECOT prison.
It looks like a sea of skin and tattoos. These images released by El Salvador's government shows the transfer of about 2,000 inmates stripped to their shorts and with their heads shaved to what's been dubbed the country's new mega prison.
He keeps pushing that line that these aren't criminals, they're terrorists. So he called that prison a terrorist confinement center. This has, of course, horrified human rights people in El Salvador and elsewhere. There's, no due process really at all. There are a lot of people who say my son or my father he wasn't affiliated to any gang, he just had a tattoo and, this is appalling. But the other side of it is it's worked. Partly because if you do imprison 3% of the male population of a country, that will certainly in the short term or even in the medium term solve the crime problem. And that's what we've been seeing in El Salvador. If you'd asked El Salvadorian people over the last decade, what is your big preoccupation? It's these gangland crimes, the fact that they felt hopeless in the face of another sort of dangerous authority, which were these gangs. So when you've solved that, however you do it, you become massively popular.
It does seem to allow him the ability to describe himself as the world's coolest dictator.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there's a separate issue here is that in the Salvadorian constitution, you shouldn't be in power for 2 terms. Now, Bukele's so popular and he's got the Congress on his side. He's now got the judges on his side. So he found a loophole for that and he got away with it because he's popular enough to get away with it. But one of the other things that I found there is you talk to people who you'd not expect to be comfortable with what's going on in El Salvador. And in fact, this surf instructor I mentioned earlier called Wasi, I thought he'd have big reservations. But when I asked him what he thought about the fact that Bukele was imprisoning 3% of the male population, he said, these people shouldn't sleep well. They've ruined our lives for a long time and they deserve punishment. And the fact that they're locked away has changed this country for the better.
So you have this very popular, if dictatorial leader running the country. He's made a huge difference to the crime rate. He seems to be winning over votes all the time. When does he hit the radar for Donald Trump? How do their paths cross?
Yes, well, I think for some of in the peripheries of the Trump movement, they've spotted Bukele a few years ago, and it became particularly noticeable actually in 2024 when there was the inauguration for Bukele's second term, controversial because really, according to the Constitution, what he was doing was illegal. So there were quite a few people who didn't attend that inauguration. Amongst those that did was Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, Tucker Carlson, the right-wing commentator, and a lot of people across the region, not just in the United States, certainly in Latin America, have seen what Bukele's done and try to imitate it and get a little bit of, hope some of that glory rubs off on them. And I think the same thing has happened in the United States, is that they've thought, really, this is what we possibly could do ourselves. Let's look at the Bukele model and see if some of it is, we can imitate it in the United States.
So the Trump camp see this strong man with huge popular appeal who seems to be getting things done in El Salvador. How do they come up with the idea for using the prison he created for terrorists to jail US deportees?
Yes, it was a twist few were expecting, really. We think probably there were plenty of discussions between people in the Trump entourage and Bukele well before Trump was inaugurated. And they came up with this idea that, one way to solve the migration problem in the United States is to deport people to El Salvador. Now, it's been portrayed by Bukele as a win-win for him because the United States is paying around $15 million a year for the people it's deported so far. If those people were going to be in prison in the United States, the costs would be considerably more. So both sides are sort of one side saving money and the other is making money.
It's like a cheap outsourcing of a problem. It's much cheaper to house them in a prison in El Salvador than it would be in America. How does the Trump administration actually make it happen? How do they legally manage to put this policy through?
Well, yes, again, had to go through masses of loops in order to do so. And what they found is the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which was a law that came into place in the wake of the American Revolution. It was aimed actually at French spies. But that law, if you sort of portray yourself, your country, your nation as at war, then there is a sort of legal opportunity to deport people without trial. So to make it all work, you have to turn those migrants, those illegal migrants, into something else, and that is into enemies of the nation. And one specific group which has been targeted that way is the Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang which operate or used to operate extensively in Venezuela, in Colombia and elsewhere. It's become the sort of bogey person of the Trump administration, the sort of big threat. So what the Trump message is that all Venezuelans are probably, part of this horrific gang. And so they're enemies to our nation, and therefore we have absolute right to deport them.
That is remarkable. So it's basically using emergency legislation, claiming they're at war to be able to use this little-known law, the Alien Enemies Act. Just describe what happened a couple of months ago in March.
In mid-March, they began deportation flights of almost entirely Venezuelans to El Salvador. When the planes were in the air, an American district judge ruled that it was illegal, that the flights needed to turn around, but it was too late. The planes were in the air and the Trump administration had no interest in turning them back.
Does the White House feel the need to comply with a verbal order from this judge?
Again, as I said, all of the planes subject to the written order of this judge departed U.S. soil, U.S. territory before the judge's written order.
But what about the verbal order, which of course carries the same legal weight as a written order, and said for the planes to turn around if they were in the air?
There's actually questions about whether a verbal order carries the same weight as a legal order, as a written order, and our lawyers are determined to ask and answer those questions in court.
Bukele, in a very typical Bukele style, kind of trolled those that said this should all not be happening. He said, whoopsie, too late, in a tweet or a posting on X.
What you're looking at is a very cynical post from a Trump ally there about what happened, with oopsie written there. So America's top diplomat, Marco Rubio, is reposting this. So he's basically sharing this to everyone. Oopsie, too late. A kind of dunking on the judge to normalize this type of legal defiance. The post is from the Trump ally who runs El Salvador, and you can see, too late, the laughing emoji.
And then we saw this sight of these planes on the San Salvador runway, guys coming off with handcuffs. Some of their feet were chained, and then they were taken off pretty brutally, put into coaches, and then less than an hour later they arrive at the SECOT prison, and then they're kind of bundled in there. This is all, again, absolutely typical of Bukele, who's this sort of marketing genius. It was all filmed like a sort of Hollywood action movie, with the government forces on the side of good, supposedly, and these hapless people being bundled, as I say, into the prison. So the Trump administration message was completely clear, and that was that they were deporting people who were gang members and effectively terrorists, and they did so completely unapologetically. But of course, it didn't take long for those of us that were looking at the names of the people deported and also saw the pictures, family members seeing their relatives in that prison, to sort of begin to piece together the identities of some of these men and realize that, not all of them were gangsters.
Stephen, you were telling us how of the supposedly members of Venezuelan gangs who have been deported from America to El Salvador, when you actually looked at the names of the people who'd been sent, you start to realise they're perhaps not all they're cracked up to be. You managed to track down some of the relatives of these men to find out more about them, to find out more about who they were and what they were doing. How easy was that?
Well, as you can imagine, the images were all over social media, and a lot of people all over the region were seeing them. And amongst those that were watching them were family members of those people that they suddenly thought, there is my relative who's had his head shaven, and what on earth is he doing in El Salvador, and what can we do to retrieve this situation? Many of those relatives are in Venezuela, the family members of migrants in Venezuela who have sort of sat back and watched in horror all of this unfold.
Mi nombre es Taryn Romero, soy hermana de Yarechilino. Will Yarechilino, mi hermano tiene 28 años.
One of the people I got in touch with is the sister of a man called Willard Chirenos.
Mi hermano se fue de Venezuela en el 2017, se fue a Santa Marta, Colombia, Santa Marta de los 3 años.
He was a tattoo artist and a barber in Valencia, in Venezuela. He left the country in 2017. He went to Colombia initially, and this is a sort of story one can hear repeated literally a million times in Venezuela, where 8 million people have left the country since 2013, a quarter of the entire population. So this chap, Willard, was one of them. And in last year, 2024, April, he made his way towards the United States because Colombia, he decided, wasn't the place for him. And he went with his girlfriend and his daughter.
They left for a journey across the jungle. And finally, they arrived after 3 months with blisters. You can imagine after 3 months, they could barely walk.
When they got to the border, they declared themselves as migrants. The girlfriend and the daughter were allowed to cross into the United States to be processed there and, were effectively free to go. He was not. Because of his tattoos, he was considered a potential threat.
Just on the basis of tattoos?
Yeah, that seems to be the case. The guy has, he's got a tattoo on his face. It's a sort of noticeable feature. But of course, he's a tattoo artist. So, that's what he does. So anyway, he ends up in this detention center and is horrified by his own situation and wants to leave and wants to go back to Venezuela. And eventually, he signs a deportation order. This is in March this year.
At 7 p.m., he called again and said, I signed a deportation paper. Imagine he had been there from January 2nd to March 14th. He was anxious and worried that he wouldn't get out. He'd never been in prison before. Being in that situation, all he wanted was to sign it and leave.
And he's in touch with his family and he says, look, I just was given this piece of paper. I want out of here. I signed it. What he didn't realize was he wasn't going back to Venezuela. He was going to El Salvador. His family were expecting him back in Venezuela. And then on March the 15th, they saw the videos that we all saw of these people going into this horrific prison. And amongst them, they saw their relative.
The last call was on the 14th. I think it was the 15th or 16th we saw the news. And on the list El Salvador had given, his name appeared in it, his full name. And I said, no way, how is he in El Salvador if he was coming to Venezuela? And a few days later, we saw the photos and videos, and we recognized him. They were shaving him, and he was kneeling.
And there he was. So, they are devastated, really, of course, by the situation that her brother is in and, feel that it's an absolute outrage that he's an innocent man that had no criminal problem in Venezuela. They just think he's completely the unfortunate guy who's in the wrong place at the wrong time.
My mom is devastated. Her blood pressure has risen many times, and sometimes she senses her son is hungry. She feels like her son is suffering. And what we ask most is for them to just return him to us, return him to Venezuela, so nothing happens to him there. It doesn't matter if they return him with nothing. On the 14th of May, his court hearing, if we don't see him, if we don't hear him, we won't know if he's alive or dead. What we want is for them to just return him to us.
And in fact, after May the 14th, we did check in with a family here in Venezuela, and they said they've had no contact at all from Willard, so they have no idea what's become of him. No communication at all, unfortunately, they told us.
I can imagine how shocking that must be for them. What did they tell you about him? You say he had no criminal background in Venezuela. I mean, is there any chance that he was part of this gang?
Anything is possible, but speaking to her, it seemed unlikely, to be quite honest. I mean, one of the issues for her family is that they are from Valencia, which is in this state of Aragua, which is where this gang, the Tren de Aragua, that you hear a lot from Trump talking about, that's where it was based. But actually, it's been much more operative outside the country recently than inside. And she says, we often get accused of this thing, just because you come from this particular city or in this particular state. But she's absolutely insists that he was just one of the millions of migrants that left Venezuela because of the economic crisis in Venezuela, just wanted to go find a better life. I think one issue here is actually perhaps there's a bit of deliberate messaging from the Trump administration, and that is, this is all really about trying to get migrants to self-deport. And if you only deport to El Salvador the worst of the worst, the real gangsters, that message may be less clear. Arguably, if we're sort of taking a Machiavellian approach, you need to deport some people who are innocent, because that means that everyone else fears that might happen to them. They're not rapists and murderers, they're innocent migrants, albeit who have crossed the border illegally, and they risk ending up in that prison unless they make their way out of the United States by their own accord.
Stephen, you mentioned that a court order tried to stop the flight that Will Chirinos and a number of other migrants found themselves on, taken into El Salvador. But that order was ignored. The flight carried on. The president tweeted, oopsie. It has, in the meantime, sparked something of a constitutional crisis in America, where people are questioning the power of the courts. Just remind us what's been happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's been absolutely intriguing and extraordinary to watch that the cases of some of these individuals, whether they're gangsters or not, but they're just sort of individuals from Salvador or Venezuela, have caused this crisis between the executive and the judiciary and asked big questions about how much power the executive should have in the United States system and what are the potential dangers of ignoring court orders. This really kind of exploded because of initially one case, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Salvadorian, who for various reasons ended up with a sort of protection order in the United States, so he couldn't be deported. Nevertheless, he was deported on one of those flights in March, and the US Justice Department admitted in court that there had been an administrative error and he shouldn't have been on that flight. Then the Supreme Court gets involved and says, right, given that, the Trump administration, the executive, needs to facilitate the return of this guy. Both Trump and President Bukele of El Salvador have said effectively, no way, this is too late. He's gone. For the time being, he's still very much in El Salvador. He's not actually in the SECOT prison. He's in another prison. But it is at the beginning, really, of what we're going to see, I think, and that is a series of battles, really, between federal judges and the Supreme Court trying to block some of these deportations. Earlier this month, a Trump-appointed federal judge permanently blocked the Trump administration from detaining those that have been deported under the Alien Enemies Act. So a sort of mighty battle is underway. So it's going to be interesting to see over the next, the coming months and years, who's going to be on top of that particular battle.
And in the meantime, what happens to the people who have been deported to El Salvador, who are stuck in this horrendous prison? Is there any hope for them? Do we know how they're being held?
Well, the Venezuelans, and most of the deportees are Venezuelans. No, the answer is we don't really know. That this is the issue of SECOT, is there's no visitation rights at all. There's no communication. Us journalists have been trying to go there. There have been a few sort of showcases, tours there, but they seem to have stopped that for the time being. So, unless there's some sort of deal for the time being, no, these people, and we have to assume that some of them are innocent and their families are, it's a sort of tunnel without end that they're entering, and let's see what happens. But it's very, very difficult to get precise information from the Salvadorian government about these, where they all are.
And in the meantime, back in America, what are the public making of this move? I mean, is there any polling to show whether this is popular?
It's interesting. I mean, I think the polling shows the polarization, actually. So 52% of Americans under one recent poll feel that Trump has gone too far with this very draconian path he's going down. But Republican support for Trump's immigration agenda in its sort of totality is really high at 94%. Pretty confident that he's the man to handle the issue. 89% say his immigration policies have made the country safer. So, there is Trump getting a little bit of the glory that Bukele has enjoyed for the last 3 years. And that is, if you're really tough and are seen to be brutal, really, on certain issues that people feel they are threatened by, then your popularity goes up. I mean, for the time being, really, you see this, what has been described as a bromance between Trump and Bukele, and they're both sort of benefiting each other. Bukele's sort of taught perhaps Trump, how to market this hard-line approach against a country's problem and how the leadership can benefit from that. Now, in the United States, it's a very different issue that's being confronted there. It's trying to demonize migrants and therefore reduce the people crossing the border and make more people deport and scare people into, leaving the country. Now, in Salvador, we're talking people their lives going from one of fear and real, genuine danger to one of a feeling of safety. There are similarities of what's going on here, both in the United States and in El Salvador, and that is, I think, both populations, to a certain extent, not the complete majority in either country, have accepted a quid pro quo. And that is, in El Salvador, okay, we're going to accept that Bukele has extraordinary and probably unconstitutional powers, but the upside for us is that we have a secure country. And in the United States, there is, it seems, by, a lot of Americans, an acceptance that judges' rulings can be overruled, that there can be a degree of lawlessness in the country for the win that some people see, that immigration is going down, that, the whole view of immigration is changing in the United States. So, there are similarities in both countries, but I think both countries run a similar risk. And that is, it's all very well in the short term or the medium term, but it's the longer term problem where you sort of undo the institutions of a country, and then you've got no tools with which to fight that back. That could well be the problem in both El Salvador and in the future in the United States.
That was Stephen Gibbs, who covers Latin America for The Times. You can find more of his work at thetimes.com with a subscription, including the tragic story of the TikTok influencer Valeria Marquez, who was shot dead in Mexico during a live stream, highlighting how influencers and the cartels have become entwined in recent years. We'll put a link to that story in the description of this episode. This podcast was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto, and with special thanks to Mary Menner and Mal Lassetto for research and translation help. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.